good morning. I want to also add my welcome. If you are here and kind of visiting us, we are journeying through this book of Revelation, and I hope that for some of you, there are just some things that we are continuing to learn about. And so if I could kind of try to summarize the first couple of chapters. Chapter 1 is really just a revelation of God unveiling who Jesus Christ is. Revelation means unveiling. And so when we think about Revelation, it's this unveiling of who Jesus Christ is. So in essence, the book of Revelation is a book about Jesus Christ. And we get to know who he is, what he has done, and what he will do. It's very exciting. Chapters 2 and 3, we were looking at the churches in Revelation. And what we see there from those is that this is a real call to live as disciples. John gives us in Revelation a radical call to discipleship. And so we saw that what Jesus wants is the church to be a lampstand to shine his light brightly. And so we see that in his word to the churches in Revelation 2 and 3. Then we come to Revelation 4 and 5. And I think the great question we have to ask ourselves from those chapters is, who do we worship? And this is another major theme in Revelation, because we can bow to anyone, but who our heart worships is a really important question. And so in Revelation 4 and 5, we're really challenged to ask ourselves, do we worship the one who sits on the throne? Because if we don't, we are worshiping someone else, the ruler of this world. And so another theme in Revelation is, who do we worship? Well, today we start chapter 6, and we're going to get into some other things. But I think one of the things that we've been talking about is this fallen Babylon and the New Jerusalem. And so one of the other themes in Revelation is that Revelation, you could say, is a tale of two cities. And it's either Babylon or it's Jerusalem, and we are citizens of one of these cities. And this is what Revelation is also going to show us. And so when we come to this idea, in the Old Testament, Cain was the son of Adam and Eve. And Cain builds a city. You can find his story if you want to look it up. It's in Genesis 4 and Genesis 9. And what's happening is that Cain really focuses on himself. He doesn't want anything to do with God, very different from his brother. And so he builds a city in order to find meaning and purpose. So he doesn't look to God for meaning and purpose. He builds a city. And then in Genesis 11, Cain and Nimrod come together to build a city with a tower, Tower of Babel, so that they can make a name for themselves. In fact, in Genesis 11, they say this, verse 3, Genesis 11, verse 3, they say to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar, and they said, "Come, let us build a city ourselves with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth." So Babel, this city, was designed to make a name for themselves. They didn't want anything to do with God. And their biggest fear was being isolated or scattered or alone. So it's really interesting how even that insecurity comes into this particular city. When we also look at the prophets, Isaiah 14, Jeremiah 50, this historical city of Babylon comes and takes God's people captive. And so what happens is that now in the Bible, Babylon is really also a symbol of a city that lives in rebellion to God and against God's people. So that's where we're getting, when you see this word Babylon in Revelation, it has so many ties to city in the Old Testament, and especially Babylon. So Babylon is a city that stands at odds against God and is against God's people. But then we also look at Isaiah chapter 65 and Ezekiel, some of the chapters in the 40s there, they talk about, they have a vision of a new city. It's Jerusalem being made new. And so it's a city of God's people, but eventually it's going to overtake this city of Babylon. And John is going to see that reality come in Revelation 21 and 22, where we're going. So if I could kind of summarize, I hope my graph is in our notes here. But basically, New Jerusalem is, yep, we can keep going to the table. New Jerusalem, yep, maybe one more. There we go. Okay. So New Jerusalem is this divine city. We're learning about it in Revelation. But this city comes from God himself. Jerusalem provides meaning and structure and purpose. And so as God's people, when we think about where do we belong? Like if we had a passport, you know how our passport here, I'm guessing for most of us, is stamped that we are citizens of the United States, right? So if we had a spiritual passport, this would be stamped City of Jerusalem. Like that is where our citizenship lies. And because of that, we have meaning for our life. We have purpose. Like it's God who gives that to us. And we have wholeness because of God and his holiness. And it's done by God's grace. Like by God's grace, we are citizens of this city. But there are others who choose not to be citizens of this particular city. And so they are citizens of Babylon. That's what Revelation is going to say. And what Revelation is painting for us is a picture of if you're a citizen of Jerusalem, your life looks like this. And sometimes it's difficult because we're living in Babylon. It's kind of like when we're a U.S. citizen and we fly over and we just kind of go visit someplace, you know, like Europe or Asia, right? We're visiting in those cities. We're in a different culture. Well, it's kind of the same way. We are citizens of New Jerusalem because we're God followers, but we're living in a different city. And so sometimes it's difficult. And that's because Babylon, this human city, has a different, it makes a name for itself. So Babylon doesn't want to make a name for God. Babylon is all about itself, making a name for whoever it is, you know, like whoever they can get up there, right? This city comes from humans. It's humans' attempt to make a name for themselves. And the meaning and purpose is all based around humans. And we can kind of see that. Doesn't that kind of start to make sense for this world that we're living in? That sometimes, you know, Peter says we're aliens to this world. And so sometimes we feel like that, right? Because we're living in a city that wasn't structured for us. It's brokenness. We see brokenness all around us. That fear of being scattered, fear of being alone and in isolation. And then this is done by human effort. Humans are always trying and trying and trying harder. And so as we progress through these chapters in Revelation, one of the questions that we want to ask ourselves is, what city are we a citizen of? Are we a citizen of fallen Babylon? A city that Revelation is going to tell us is doomed to destruction. It's ruled by Satan, where citizens provide its structure and purpose. Or are we citizens of a new Jerusalem, a city that's ruled by God, a city where God provides the structure, the meaning, the purpose of our lives? And what we need to realize is that our citizenship doesn't start the moment that we die. What Revelation wants us to understand is that our citizenship starts that moment we decide to trust in Jesus Christ. And so even now, we are citizens of God's kingdom. And one of the things that he wants us to do is to continue to bring God's kingdom literally into enemy territory, into a different city. And so this is kind of what's going on as we're getting into Revelation.
Well, I'm going to bring us to chapter 6 and the seals. Now, these are the seals that are on the scroll, not the aquatic animal. that you might think of when you hear the word seal. Oh man, illustration just came to mind. I don't know if you remember in the awful tragedy of the oil release in the Valdez, that had released that oil, and then there was the great cleanup effort, and one of them was several thousands and thousands of dollars where they had saved the life of this one seal. And so it was time for this seal. I mean, I'm talking I think it was $80,000 to save the life of this seal. And so they all got together in celebration, to release the seal back into nature. Do you remember what happened? Yeah, so he jumps off the island and into the water. Everybody's cheering and celebrating. All of a sudden, this great whale comes and gulp, just like that. Yeah, so you got to be careful, I guess, with those efforts, some money just down the drain there. Not that kind of seal. A seal that's going to be on the document here that Jesus has. As we look at the seven seals, want to give you a little bit of setup and context in that. Remember the seven churches, right? When we looked at the seven churches, we actually kind of called that the good, the bad, and the ugly. When it comes to the seven seals, we have some of that too. Some of what's good, some of what's bad, and some of what is really ugly. The other is that when you think of the book of Revelation, a lot of times we think about pending trouble, things that are happening in the future. But actually, tribulation in every instance in the book of Revelation is in the present perfect tense, meaning that it's something that is ongoing. And so this is commentary really on church history, and the seals are reflective of what is taken place or what happened at the cross. If you remember, right, we talked about how Revelation's a revelation of who Jesus is, and a lot of that's connected with what happened at the cross. So thinking of those things, let me just run through the seals, and then I'm going to hand it back to Pastor Tammy. But it says, verse 1, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. Then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, there before me was the white horse, a rider that held a bow and was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. And so there are some interpretations that have said this is the Antichrist trying to connect it with other horses. But this one who is given a crown and who conquers is Jesus. It's because he fulfilled the Father's purposes in going to the cross, right? He had interest in it going someplace else in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he said, not my will, but your will be done. And so he did it. He went to the cross and he conquered sin and the grave for us at the cross, so we might have this forgiveness. And so here it is this Jesus who's coming on the white horse. Now it says the rider held a bow. You wonder what was a bow, but there's no arrows. But actually that word is similar to one that's used for rainbow in the Greek. And so it seems to be some kind of natural phenomenon. He's given a crown. He is a conqueror that is bent on conquest. And that is because of what he did on the cross. He is the one who is the victor. And so that's the white horse that comes, followed by this. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. And of course, this is reflective in a fiery red horse, and its rider is the work of the enemy. I mean, that's something that happens and takes place right at the fall, is that our peace, the peace that we had with God, the relationship that Adam and Eve had with God in the Garden of Eden, at the fall is broken. And it no longer is defined by peace. That peace has been stolen. And so we see that then people then even kill each other. And so division and divisiveness come with this second rider. Then says, verse 5, when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice coming from the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat in a day, for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, and do not damage the oil and wine. And what we can see here is what's ushered in is this great economic difficulty. What it means is that even the basic elements now are a day's wage. And so you have across the land like great economic discrepancy. And so that's what's ushered in, by this rider as well. What is incredible is that is something that you can see across the world, right? I mean, is wealth in the world evenly divided everywhere? No, right? When you think about, sometimes I share with you, it used to be Global Rich List, but, what it is that, typically the average person in the world lives on about $2.50 a day. And of course, in America, it is typically quite a bit more, right? And so there is this economic injustice, but we see that that's also defined here by this rider and horse. And then it says, when he opened, let me make sure I didn't miss it. Nope, I don't want to skip one here. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by wild beasts of the earth. And so here we see, right, this is what enters in at the fall is death and Hades. We saw in the first chapter that it was Jesus, right, who takes that power back at the cross. He actually allows people to defeat death and Hades, but here it enters in to the human experience at the fall, that is what takes place. When it says power over a fourth of the earth, we're trying in our own minds to comprehend this. I mean, I think that's one of the things I think about the book of Revelation is that it was a letter and it connects with imagery in another time. And a lot of times what we're trying to do, so they were listening to it, but for us, a lot of times we're very visual now, and so we're trying to visualize it, and it's very difficult to do. But when it comes to a fourth of the earth, that actually, it's not like 1/4 of the earth. It's actually referring to 4 generations. The reference is that, typically in a family, when there's someone who decides, to follow God, not always, but the impact can be seen for generations. I think of that just, in my own life and family, and how it's, different for my kids than it was when I grew up. But also, too, that's like when someone chooses not to follow God. Often there are the ripple effects out to the 4th generation, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So that's what the fourth is here, is that idea that this is what, happens. And so, again, difficulty all over with a famine, plague, wild beasts. Number 9, when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe and were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. Wow, what a picture with this 5th seal. This altar here is not necessarily an altar that we might see, in a church and might soon see here. but it's actually, the reference here is the altar of sacrifice. Remember, we were just in the tabernacle for a few weeks, and we talked about the altar of sacrifice kind of being that centerpiece as you came in. And what was there was all these sacrifices that were made, right? And so here it's this recognition in this fifth seal that there have been martyrs. There have always been martyrs, those who were killed for the faith. In fact, I remember reading, maybe it was about a year and a half ago, this is what we don't realize and sometimes miss, is that the church is under as great a persecution possibly as it ever has been in church history in present days. We don't necessarily, we probably won't feel that this morning. We haven't for a while here, but there are so many places in the world where the church is under persecution. I think of a story that I shared with you about a year ago when there was a group that was meeting, and part of what got you into the church meeting was that you brought a 5-gallon pail of water. Because what would happen as the church was meeting is that people were throwing in Molotov cocktails into the gathering place, helping to hurt somebody, but hoping to set it on fire. And so they all had gallons of water, that they would put on it, and then they would continue in worship. Like, we don't think about that, right? Like, that's not our experience, but that is the experience for so many across the world, as they gather. And these martyrs are just given this encouragement, right, of the white robe, and just to be patient just a little longer. Justice will come. And then 12, as I watch as they open the sixth seal, there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. The stars of the sky fell to the earth. The fig drops from the fig tree were shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. We can see here that, in the opening of this scroll, is that it is a display, of God's power, right? His power that emanates, right, when he comes and, there's thunder and there's just all these pieces that, are part of nature, that even these natural things take place because of his presence. And then 15, it says, then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich and the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? When you look at the book of Revelation, I talked about how it was a reflection upon what took place at the cross. For a number of us here, we look at the cross and we look upon it fondly because it is the place where our Savior died. It is the place where our salvation was won. It is the place where forgiveness was granted. That if we, and invite God into our life, that, the cross is this beautiful and precious time, thing for us in our lives. But we can see in Revelation, as you think of it this way, is that when it comes to the finish, it's really the choice of us. You see, God's not going to force into heaven anyone who doesn't want to be there. I mean, we make the choice of where we finish and where we spend eternity. That's our choice. It's our decision. And what we see in Revelation is that not everybody makes the decision to be a faithful one, to be one who follows. And so for them, the cross becomes this place of judgment. And so when we reflect on the cross in that kind of way, this is what we see, is that the judgment of God comes to bear for those who decide they don't want heaven, they don't want to be with God, right? And so the reward comes for those who do, but it is judgment, and it is catastrophic for those who don't. And so Revelation gives us some of that picture. Again, this picture in Revelation, what is so helpful is twofold. One, for us to look at it and say, truly, truly, is God the one I love? Is God the one to whom I am faithful? Is God the one whom I'm following? I don't want to pretend. I don't want to go through the motions. I don't want to portray any kind of image. Deep down, sincerely, with my heart of hearts, down to my core, I love God and I follow him. And then we realize that there are some who just choose not to and who don't, and that eternity is very different for them. And so when we look at it, right, we want to make sure that we are right for eternity, that we have set our projection is, with God, and he is the one whom we want to be with. I think the desire is to look at the book of Revelation and to be real about who we are, who we love, who we worship, and to be sure that we are following God with our lives.
So with Revelation 5, we have that picture of Jesus, who is the only one who is worthy to take the scroll and to open the 7 seals. And the 7 seals really are showing us the parameters that God has had throughout history that lead us today and will lead generations should Jesus tarry to come. And so these are the parameters of Jesus being the one who rides in conquest, of how Satan has a certain amount of power that God has allowed him to have. One of the things I love about Revelation is that it's very clear that God is the powerful one, and he has established boundaries and parameters for what can and cannot happen. And so this unveiling where God is pulling back the curtain so John can see it, he's allowing us to have this greater glimpse into spiritual things. There's a preliminary chapter before we even get to the 7th seal, and it's an interesting chapter that I just want to read one of the verses in Revelation 7, and it says in verse 2, it says, "I saw another angel coming up from the east carrying the seal of the living God. And he shouted to those 4 angels who had been given power to harm land and sea, 'Wait, don't harm the land or the sea or the trees until we have placed the seal of God on the foreheads of his servants.'" This is one of the things that we are not, I want to touch on it because there's this, we have to remember, and we learn this in Romans, but when we become followers of Jesus Christ, we have the seal of the Holy Spirit on our life. And I'm not sure we think about that a lot, but it's very, very important because in the spiritual realm, it identifies us as a Christ follower. And so sometimes, I don't know how you were brought up, but sometimes we kind of go through Revelation thinking of all the terrible things that happen to Christians. And really, one of the things that we begin to learn in Revelation is that God followers have a seal placed upon them because of their following Jesus. And we learn that the ones who are really afraid in Revelation are those who have chosen not to follow Christ. And as we journey through Revelation, we begin to understand this picture, how there is a certain protection for those who follow Christ. This seal is very important. And I mention that because we're getting into chapter 8, where in verse 1 it says, "When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour." I love this verse. It's so interesting to me because when we come off of chapters 4 and 5, we realize that there is continuous day and night worship of God. So, like, there has always been this worship of Christ, and when I get to this, there's a half an hour of silence, and I'm like, what an interesting verse. But really, it's an anticipation of what's to come. Because what happens is the seventh seal that is opened here by Jesus now opens 7 trumpets. And we saw in chapter 1 where John, he heard the trumpets. We think back to the Old Testament, how the trumpet always announced the things of God to come. And so these trumpets are kind of these announcements that are going to happen. The other thing that's really interesting here in chapter 8, as these trumpets are being blown, in Revelation 8, verse 2, it says, I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense together with the prayers of God's people went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth, and there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. What is so interesting here, another theme of Revelation, is how important prayer is. And this is one of those places. You know, when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, what does he tell them? So one of the things that we are to pray is, your kingdom come, your will be done. This is a prayer that we have been taught to pray. And you think of these prayers, when we are praying that kind of prayer up to God, saying, your kingdom, like today, help me to live as a citizen of your kingdom, because I want more of your kingdom to come into this world. I want it to reflect more of you, Jesus. Boy, when we're praying prayers like that, Revelation is showing us how our partnership in prayer is allowing these things of Christ to come. And so prayer now begins a wonderful partnership that we have with God, of why we would spend time in prayer and asking God to do the things that he has even asked us to pray for. So here there's a real reference to the Day of Atonement, which we talked about with the Old Testament tabernacle, where that was the day that the high priest came in with the prayers of all God's people. And so that's really a reference here in how our prayers are these golden, stored in these golden bowls. Our time is short, so I'm just going to kind of summarize the trumpets for us. And then this is one of the reasons we have the growth group, so I hope that you will come for more discussion Wednesday or Saturday morning as we talk about this. But chapter 8 goes through some of the trumpets that are blown. And what we realize is that the first 4 trumpets stand together, and the last 3 are kind of together, kind of like the seals were. The first 4 trumpets really show us kind of a picture of what has happened to creation because of sin in the world. Because what happened when Satan began to rule back in Genesis chapter 3, there was an effect upon all of creation. And so the first 3 trumpets really reveal what effect has happened on creation. I'm just going to read some of the verses here, starting at verse 6. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down to the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. And so what we see here is that creation, because of the fall, was affected. We live in a creation that is not the way that God had planned for it to be. Verse 8, the second angel sounded his trumpet. Something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And so here, now we're seeing how earth was affected, but now we're seeing how the sea is not a safe place for its creatures to live in the way that God had designed it because of sin in the world. Verse 10, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky, and a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So here we see how even the water is not safe to drink anymore. how even the sun, the moon, and the stars were affected by sin, and even that is not how we live under the fallenness of this, and it still affects us today. And then verse 12, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet. A third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark, and a third of the day was without light, and a third of the night. So here, what these trumpets are painting for us, and we can discuss it more. But basically, because of sin in the world, creation itself was affected by the fall. And so the world that we live in, creation, does not perfectly provide for our needs. It's not whole. It's not what God designed when we read how God created the world in Genesis 1 and 2. What we're going to learn, the good news, is that by the time we get to Revelation 22, God has restored creation to its perfection. But what John is seeing is that sin has affected this world that we live in. And so really what it's doing is just describing for us the realities of what we know, that the world we live in doesn't adequately provide for our needs in the way that God had intended for it to do. And so John here just really sees this disruption of creation and how creation suffers. In Romans, it talks about how creation just groans because of the effects of sin. And so sometimes we don't always think about that. The next trumpets are really aimed toward the effects of what happens to those who choose not to follow Christ. And these trumpets begin with woe. In fact, it says, woe, woe, woe. And we've seen this threesome before. We've seen holy, 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 right? In Revelation 4 and 5, holy, holy, holy. And now we get to chapter 8, and it says, woe, woe, woe are the inhabitants of the earth. This is verse 11. And so what's beginning to happen is that what God wants the inhabitants of the earth, that's always a word for people who choose to not follow Christ. And so he's saying, your life, apart from me, is not whole. There are effects that you feel, the brokenness that you feel because you do not follow me. And so these last three trumpets are effects for people who do not choose to follow Christ. What I love about Revelation is that this is a book also written in the present tense, because the word is written for those who have not yet chosen to follow Christ. There is still time. It's what I love about this book. And so God wants us to clearly understand the effects of the cross and what that means, and how there's a real heaven and a real hell. And he's saying here, your life is woeful. Your life is meaningless without me. And so in chapter 9, you see the fifth and sixth trumpets being blown and what is happening there. If it's all right, I'm going to stop there. Just because of our time today, and maybe we can either pick up there, or we will decide what to do. This Revelation has been an interesting one for us to journey through. But yes, if I could just leave it off, that Revelation is giving us this choice, as Christopher said, that we can choose to be followers of Christ, or we are choosing not to be, and Revelation is allowing us to make that choice.
That we could probably spend a year or a couple of years on Revelation. I'm sure that some have, but we're working through, as we can and trying to help in understanding. But much like in the book of Revelation, basically there is the creation of the two sides, right? Those who follow God and those who don't. And Revelation is making it really black and white for us. Those who understand the gospel, have received the forgiveness of Christ and walk in it, and then those who deny Christ. And so it's interesting, and one of the commentaries was talking about the seals and their reflection, that even presently now, this is why sharing in Holy Communion the Eucharist is so important, that God has given to us as believers this very practical, meaningful, continual way to reflect and to say, I understand the cross, I understand the sacrifice that Jesus has made. The cross was a one-time event in history, but the church, carrying forward, celebrates in Holy Communion, in the broken body of Christ, the shed blood of Christ, remembering his sacrifice for us.